Hey, today is the 15th day. That means we're reading Mark chapter 15. Okay, Mark chapter 15. So we picked up on 14, where they took Jesus in at nighttime, took him to the high priest, and they took him before the council. Remember, these are the two things that Mark didn't report, but we learned in Matthew. But then we pick up in 15, it says, and as soon as it was morning, the council, the Sanhedrin, it was against Jewish law to make judgments or verdicts at night. They just set those rules so things wouldn't be shady, right? So, which exactly is what it was, right? So they waited till morning, probably early morning, as soon as the sun broke, probably like 5:59 a.m. And it says they meet, they had a consultation, boom, they agreed Jesus is guilty. And so they took him to Pilate. Now, there's a lot that you kind of got to learn through history and read about. Pilate was a wicked man. Pilate was not a friend to the Jews. He was very much against the Jews. And so the Jews, the Pharisees, taking Jesus to him, they expected he would easily kill him. He would get rid of him. He didn't care. It would have been very easy process for Pilate just to do away with Jesus, right? And so he comes to Pilate, and notice what Pilate asked him. He says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Pilate is not a Jew. He's a Roman. He could care less about the religious institution of what the Jewish system is. So why does he ask, is he the king of the Jews? The Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the chief priest, the high priest would have known that if they took a man to a Roman governor, Pilate, and said, he is saying that he is God, that Roman governor would say, so what? I'll worship 200 gods, 300 gods, right? Rome is full of gods. I don't care. Get out of here. So the high priest, the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, all those people, they're very smart, the smartest people around, right? So they take him to Pilate, and they don't say, oh, he's claiming to be God. He said he's claiming to be the king of Jews. Now remember, Pilate is the governor of Israel, of a Jewish territory. So we kind of get in this political mindset, right? If he's the king of Jews, then that means he would want to dethrone Pilate and eventually dethrone emperor, right? Caesar. So he has to do something about this, right? So they lied in a way, but honestly, they were telling the truth, right? They said he's the king of the Jews. He is the Messiah. He's the one that's coming to dethrone Rome and to save Israel, which is kind of what happens. He is the Messiah, right? But they don't believe that. And so that's what they say. So that's why Pilate says, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus doesn't answer. He says, you say that I am. And basically, Jesus doesn't give a defense. And notice in verse 5, it says that Pilate was amazed. He marveled at Jesus. Many men have stood in front of Pilate and begged and groveled and pleaded for mercy and grace, but Jesus did not. He stood there and without word and without crosswords and took what was to be given to him, right? He's fulfilling his Father's will. Then we see that basically Pilate understands he's innocent, and he gives somebody away every year at Passover out of his jail, and so he brought up what he thought was the worst one, right? He gives up Barabbas. It says insurrectionist. Just think in your mind a terrorist, right? Somebody, a terrorist. And so he brings them up in the crowd. But notice it says that the chief priest stirred up the crowd, right? So it's them kind of prodding and poking the crowd to get them to do their bidding, right? And so they wanted to release Barabbas and kill Jesus. So much they say, crucify him, not once, but we see that they say that twice. They shouted all the more, crucify, crucify. So so Pilate, wishing to satisfy the crowd, released them for Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. Now, we know the crucifixion story, but reading through Matthew, and especially reading through Mark here, It's amazing on the exact words that Jesus told over and over to his disciples, right? I'm going to be handed over. I'm going to be mocked. I'm going to be scourged. I'm going to be flogged. I'm going to be stripped. All these words that he said to his disciples, and his disciples were like, no way, no way, no way. It comes true. And this is just Mark, right? Mark is here hearing, he's hearing these words, and now he is proving exactly what Jesus said, right? So it's just interesting how it happens, these exact same words. Of course, Jesus is mocked, exactly what we were just talking about, right? He took him away. Verse 2, it says they called together the whole battalion. For any other person they're crucifying, it's a 4-man detail. They were professional executioners. It's all that they did. 4 Roman soldiers. There would have been more than 4, but they would kind of stayed in kind of a squad of 4, a detail of 4, and they would have kind of done everything. But here they bring the whole battalion. They bring everybody. So more hits, more spitting, more mocking, just more and more and more that's doing this. They put on a purple cloak and twisted crown of thorns. Back in those days, kings, even Caesar himself, emperor, he wore purple, and he would have a gilded wreath of leaves around his head to show that he was the king. So they put on some purple, probably a faded out Roman garment that was not purple, just kind of looked purple. Purple is very expensive. It was only for kingly use. But then of course, they didn't have a golden laurel wreath around his head, right? So they put something of thorns, right? Twisted thorns together. That was painful. And they did those things. And they spit on him. They mocked him, all things that Jesus predicted. And it says that, and they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene. It's out of North Africa. If you go on a map, this man walked about 800 miles to get to Jerusalem, right? So he's probably coming to Jerusalem for Passover. He knows probably nothing about Jesus. We don't even know if he's heard a story about Jesus up until this point. But what happens is he was called to carry his cross. Now, we see the stories in the movies that Jesus carries this big cross. That's not true. They would carry the crossbeam. Crossbeam was probably around 100 pounds. The total cross was about 300 pounds. But it was very common for criminals to carry their own crossbeam. But Jesus was beaten so bad, they wanted him to make it to the place of crucifixion, right? So they got Simon to stand in. A little side note, you see that it says the follower of Alexander and Rufus. Now, for one, besides being Rufus, a weird name, makes me think of Rufio from Hook, just a little side note, but Rufus. You can find these names of great Christians in the book of Romans. Paul writes about them. And so we can take from this moment of Simon carrying him and seeing everything, that probably Simon became a believer. He raised his children to be believers, and then they were great believers for the church in the book of Romans. And so just a little note there. You can do some studying on your own if you didn't know that. Or I'll talk about it when we get to Romans, right? And they brought him to a place called Golgotha. A lot of people call it Calvary. Calvary is Latin. Golgotha is Aramaic. It's known as the place of the skull, or known as the skull, basically. It's a place where everybody died. It can look like a skull. If you ever by my office, I have a picture of this place back in the 1900s on my wall. It looks just like a skull. It's set on the outside of Jerusalem. So as people were coming to Jerusalem, they would see these people crucified, dead, hanging on the crosses to basically say, beware, you better do good or we will kill you, right? And so it's kind of set up high on a hill, and the road into Jerusalem was below it. And so people would see it from a far distance as they were traveling into Jerusalem. But they were there. Notice it says, and they offered him a wine mixed with myrrh. It was common practice that as people were crucified, they would give them this. Basically think of it as like a sedative. It was something, but Jesus did not take this, okay? We'll talk more about that in a second. And they divided and crucified him. And they crucified him and divided his garments and casting lots for them. That was a prophecy from Psalms 22, and even Jesus himself prophesied that too. And then in verse 25 it says, and it was the third hour. Now this is an interesting note, and I can't dive too much into this. But in the book of John 19, when we get to it and we read about this, John says it was the 6th hour. Mark says it was the 3rd hour. So the hours start at 6 a.m., right? So 0 hour is at 6. So when it says 3, it's 9 a.m. When John says the 6th hour, that's noon. And so there's a lot to be said there. A lot of people talk about it. It really doesn't matter. It doesn't change the story. Once again, you have two people accounting. So some time could be off. Some people believe that maybe somebody messed up as they were translating scripture. It doesn't matter. I mean, there's a lot of talk about it, but it really doesn't matter. Somewhere, it's not like they could look at their Timex on their wrist, right? And so it's kind of just, it is what it is, right? And so somewhere between 9 a.m. and noon, they crucified him. They crucified Jesus and two robbers next to him. Like I said, it was very common for people to be crucified. It was very normal. And so not only do they crucify this Jesus, but they had some people on death row, and they were going to go on and do that too, right? If they're up there, might as well add some more people. And so you see, as you read through that, it says that people who are walking by berated him. Even the two thieves on the cross, they berated him. And so all these people are mocking him, right? And so we can just tell, not only on the cross, not only is he in pain, not only is he in anguish, not only is he hungry and thirsty, hard to believe all those things, but he's still getting mocked just as he said. But when the 6th hour came, that's noon, had come, there was darkness over the land until the 9th hour, to 3. So there was about 3 hours of complete darkness. There's cosmological event that happened that was complete darkness. And at the 9th hour, Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Once again, my God is a prophecy back to Psalms 22. But why have you forsaken me? This is the first time that God and Jesus were not one. God had to turn his back. Jesus took upon all the sins of mankind. And so therefore, because he was unholy, God could not look at him. And so, yes, there was physical pain. Yes, there was mental pain. Yes, there was emotional pain. But this is spiritual pain. And that's really what we're talking about here. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, right? It says that he bore that sin. And even a prophecy in the book of Isaiah chapter 53, it says that it pleased God to bruise him. It pleased God. Even though it was his son, it pleased him because he knew the outcome, right? He had to be killed for our salvation. It says some people were making fun of him, saying that he was calling out to Elijah. Verse 36, it says, someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down. So this sour wine is different than the first one. The first wine was mixed with some narcotics that was used as a sedative. Jesus didn't want none of that. The sour wine is a normal wine. It's what we call a working man's wine, that it would be almost like a vinegar-based wine. And so it just hadn't fully fermented. And so you kind of have the taste of some half-fermented grapes, and so it's kind of weird. It's just a working man, a cheap man wine. Basically, it's their Gatorade, their water, right? And so he took the second one. It did not have the sedatives. It's different. You need to make sure you understand that. And it says, wait, let us see if Elijah will come and take him. Basically, people not knowing scripture, they're thinking they've got this whole Elijah thing wrong, just as they did in what we talk about Sunday, right? In the Transfiguration. And so they just got the idea, right? John the Baptist was the Elijah, not Elijah. And so there was a little bit difference. And so with a loud voice, he breathed his last. John chapter 19 tells us, he says, it is finished, right? Salvation is finished. The old way, the old covenant is done. It is finished. Now we are into the new covenant. And that's why the temple veil was torn. The space between God and man was torn from the top and bottom. Now we are under grace. Man can come to God through grace and through grace alone. And so it was never about the works and the sacrifices of the temple. That was a substitute until the real lamb came, and Jesus was that lamb. We can see confirmation from the centurion. He says truly that he was a man of God. We see lots of women there. Notice verse 41 was in Galilee. They followed him and ministered to him, and there were also many other women who came up to him, who came with him in Jerusalem. We get this idea that it was just Jesus and 12 disciples. He traveled with an entourage. Okay, men are helpless. We can't do anything. We need help. We need women's travel. And so, those women that were traveling with them probably helped with food and cleaning and traveling and finding room and lodge and all the things that women do for us, right? Telling them which way to go, right? Which direction. You got to turn left here, right? And so just even like today, I've heard it said my whole life, why is the church always a bunch of women? Men will never do it. Men will never step up and be godly men. Well, I think it's true. Men don't really step up to be godly men. And so, but from the very beginning, the church has always been full of women because I think they just like a child, right? Jesus says, come to him like a child. They have a special kind of faith where men can't get over that. And so we can see that. We see Jesus is buried. We see Joseph of Arimathea. He's a part of the Sanhedrin. One note I want to put out here in verse 43, it says that he took courage and went to Pilate. He's on the Sanhedrin. He's a Pharisee. He's been a part of this. And so now he has to go against all of his friends. He took courage and he did the right thing. He goes to Pilate. He gets the body. He comes and he brings a linen shroud, right? Basically meaning it's temporary because it's Passover. It's Sabbath. And so they have to get this done before Sabbath. So they basically put him in there, put some spices on him and some ointment. They cover him. They close the tomb. And their whole idea is they're coming back on Sunday, right? They're coming back on Sunday to finish the embalming process. And then they would close that tomb for good, right? But God's got a different idea, right? And so they planned to go back Sunday, but they went back to an empty tomb. Amen. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. All right. I'm so glad we're doing this. You got one more day to finish the book of Mark. I'm so proud of you guys for doing this, and we'll see you tomorrow on the last chapter, Mark 16. God bless.